What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a bit of an opinion, really, about what Bloodlines 2 needs to do to be successful, at least very broadly speaking. So recently, we saw the release of Vampire the Masquerade Swan Song, which was the latest of a series of narrative RPGs that have been released for the Vampire the Masquerade setting. If you're unaware, since the original Bloodlines, the vast majority, and I think basically all, of the Vampire the Masquerade game releases have been narrative RPGs, with the likes of Coteries of New York, its standalone expansion, Shadows of New York, several text-based narrative RPGs of Night Road, Out for Blood, Parliament of Knives, Sins of the Sires, and then of course we have the Battle Royale Blood Hunt, which is, a bit different just because of the fact that it's a Battle Royale. So that said, Bloodlines 2, if it ever actually sees the light of day, which is definitely up for debate at the moment, but provided that it does eventually get released, it will be the first traditional RPG, if you will, for the Vampire the Masquerade franchise in probably 20 years or so. And I wanted to talk about this because a lot of the narrative RPGs especially, I see rehashing a lot of the same concepts over and over. And there are a few reasons that I think that is, primarily because all of them are developed by different people. The World of Darkness is what the universe, if you will, of Vampire the Masquerade is called, and it encompasses a bunch of TTRPGs: Hunter, The Reckoning, Vampire the Masquerade, Wraith the Oblivion. There's several others, actually. But it's a series of tabletop games that collectively make up the World of Darkness. And the World of Darkness has licensed a lot of stuff out, which is how we keep getting these narrative RPGs, etc. that we've been seeing. Now, overall, I will say that the text-based narrative RPGs tend to explore different concepts than the actual graphical ones will, which honestly I think is a little easier for them just because the text-based ones are essentially reading a book. But nonetheless, I've noticed a lot of the same plot elements come up over and over again. And in addition to this licensing that I mentioned, I think a big part of that is that all of them seem to want to recreate the TTRPG as a narrative RPG because it's a good medium for it. And if you're strictly talking about what the TTRPG is, I would agree with you. I think a narrative RPG is a very good medium for translating the tabletop version because Vampire the Masquerade as a tabletop game is very narrative focused. It's much more about the story than, say, like the combat you would see in Dungeons & Dragons or Pathfinder or a myriad of other TTRPGs. Now, some of this, I think, is down to the fact that the powers that they've given these vampires can be a little hard to quantify. But given all those things, the fact that we're seeing this licensing to various companies who aren't coordinating with each other, and the fact that I think, again, they're trying to replicate what the TTRPG is, has resulted in a sort of failure to expand upon what the universe has to offer. Because again, we just see a lot of the same stuff over and over and over again. A lot of these games basically act as a primer to the World of Darkness, and more specifically Vampire the Masquerade, of course, which in and of itself is fine, but at this point I think we're a little bit past that. We've had like 5 or 6 of these narrative RPGs games that have done this, and again, they all touch on basically the same things, and as a result I think it's gotten incredibly stale. Which, to finally circle this back around to the point of this video, I think Bloodlines 2 really needs to set itself apart from these narratives that we've gotten up to this point. Because if Bloodlines 2 releases, and the story is basically the same stuff we've seen up to this point, where it's basically 90% local court vampire intrigue where someone absolutely betrays you 100% of the time, then I think that's going to ultimately result in a very boring story for what could be an amazing game. Which is a shame, because at this point, there's still so much about the Vampire the Masquerade universe that just does not get touched on in the video games, or at least explored in any great depth. Now, some of this, I realize, is almost entirely done as a reason to keep the older vampires out of the limelight, if you will. Because if you're unaware, in Vampire the Masquerade, older vampires, and more specifically, vampires that are closer to the generation of their origin, are stronger. Meaning that from the original vampire, the further you get away from it generationally speaking, the weaker the vampires get. Typically speaking, the very old ones that are part of like the 4th and 5th generation of vampires are over 1,000 years old, and they're basically demigods. And as a result, if you put those guys in the game, you've got a pretty big problem as they're, essentially unkillable. However, I don't think that's a valid enough excuse to shy away from using them. Quite the opposite. I think they should make it a big deal, make it integral to the story, but use these resources that are part of your universe to do something interesting. All of these older vampires, for instance, are supposed to have been called to the cradle of vampire origin, shall we say, in what is known as the Beckoning. Basically, all older vampires hear this call to go to a specific place in the world and fight in a sort of vampire war. Which, again, let's be honest, that's just a plot point to keep them away from the main game. However, I think it would be incredibly interesting if one of these games actually explored that, like what is going on. But again, I realize simply for the sake of the storytelling, they just don't want to advance what is happening with that, so I doubt they want to set anything in stone, but I think that would be incredibly interesting to actually see in practice. I think there are other concepts that also don't get touched on, or explored in any great depth. Like, for instance, the scientific reasoning behind their being. We've actually started to see this a little bit. You can actually see it in Swansong even, but it's also mentioned here and there. In the 5th edition of Vampire the Masquerade, there's this thing called blood resonance, which is basically the emotional state of the blood that a vampire consumes, which can then have an effect on them. And you actually start to see some of this studied scientifically, if you will, in games or mentioned in narratives recently. And that, I think, explored as a concept in-game could be really cool. I think that was honestly the most interesting part of Swansong for me. But even beyond that, we can hear reference of mortals with true faith, which in this setting, it's incredibly rare, but mortals of any religion are capable of something known as true faith, which basically makes them an extreme threat to a vampire because a vampire can't even approach a person that has it if they don't want them to. Which, for my more regular viewers, you can think of a mortal with true faith like a cleric with repel undead from Pathfinder or D&D. And by nature of their true faith, they've basically become untouchable to vampires, which is incredibly interesting. And there's even more to that I'm not explaining here that I think would be awesome explained in depth in an RPG as more than just a footnote. So as you can see, there's so much territory here that is just ripe for storytelling and interesting encounters in an RPG. And so far, all we've really gotten is a rehashing of the same old stuff in a narrative RPG, presented in largely the same way. And while I do really enjoy Vampire the Masquerade, if you couldn't tell, I nonetheless feel like if Bloodlines 2 comes out and it just rehashes the same stuff that all of these narrative RPGs have covered, and it doesn't do anything new, and it's just more of the same local Camarilla court drama, then I don't think it's going to go well, frankly. Bloodlines 2, let's be real, it's the flagship of what Vampire the Masquerade is. And to do anything less than something wildly ambitious that covers ground that you haven't covered in even your actual publication releases, then I think you are setting yourself up for a missed opportunity. So if anybody from World of Darkness, Paradox, whoever happens to watch this video, I'm well aware you're probably not going to change anything simply because some random YouTuber says that this isn't going to work, but I'm telling you, if it's just a game that rehashes these same old plot points and does the same old thing, you are setting yourself up for failure with what is supposed to be the biggest part of your franchise. So do yourself a favor and think about what this game is before it actually gets released. Because on top of all the drama that's already been surrounding Bloodlines 2, I think most people are either A, expecting it to be canceled, or B, there's going to be such a high level of scrutiny on this game if it ever does get released. There you guys go, just a discussion/opinion piece about what Bloodlines 2 needs to do to be successful, so hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.